Here is something to think about. You are looking at a gravel path. All the stones look random, chaotic, but suddenly your brain picks out a shape hidden in the pattern. You saw it, even though no sharp edge gave it away. What if the secret to that moment of recognition is not which neurons fire, but which ones are firing in sync?
Oh, that's a fascinating way to put it. So today's paper is about synchrony, neurons pulsing together like a chorus.
Exactly. Today we look at a 2026 paper from Maastricht University that makes a bold argument. The brain uses gamma band synchrony, a specific rhythm in the range of 30 to 80 cycles per second, as a mechanism for pulling figures out of visual backgrounds. And the most remarkable part, the very features that critics thought made gamma synchrony useless as a signal turn out to be the very features that make it work.
Okay, let me make sure I understand the starting point. The visual cortex generates these gamma oscillations, rhythmic electrical pulses, and for a long time people thought those rhythms might be doing something important for perception.
Right, the idea has been around since the 1990s. The proposal was called feature binding. When you look at a red apple, your visual system has to connect the redness, the roundness, the shininess, all processed in different parts of the brain into a single unified object. One popular theory said neurons that encode parts of the same object synchronize their gamma oscillations, and that shared rhythm is what binds those features together.
That sounds elegant, so why did it become controversial?
Two observations hurt the theory badly. First, it turned out that gamma frequency is not the same everywhere. Neurons responding to a brighter patch of the image oscillate faster than neurons responding to a dimmer patch. So if an object has varying brightness, the neurons encoding it are oscillating at different rates, hard to synchronize. Second, gamma synchrony turned out to depend on physical distance. Nearby neurons synchronize readily, neurons far apart, much less so. Critics said this makes gamma synchrony unreliable for binding objects that span large portions of the visual field.
Wait, so the argument was essentially, gamma is too variable to be a useful code.
Precisely. Several prominent researchers concluded that these stimulus dependencies were fatal flaws, that gamma synchrony could not be a reliable grouping mechanism. But there was a minority view saying something very different. What if those dependencies are not bugs, but features? What if the brain is actually exploiting them?
That's a real flip in perspective. So this paper is testing that minority view.
That is exactly what Karimian and colleagues set out to do. They wanted to show that the same properties critics use to dismiss gamma synchrony are precisely the properties a working synchrony-based grouping mechanism requires.
So what is the theoretical framework they are working from?
They build on something called the theory of weakly coupled oscillators, often shortened to TWCO. Think of it as the mathematics of how any two rhythmic systems influence each other. Whether you are talking about two pendulums hanging from the same shelf, two fireflies flashing near each other, or two neurons oscillating in neighboring columns of visual cortex, the same basic rules apply.
And what are those rules?
Two coupled oscillators will synchronize if two conditions balance out. The first is how different their natural rhythms are. This gap is called detuning. The more they differ in frequency, the harder it is to synchronize. The second is how strongly they are connected, the coupling strength. Strong coupling can overcome large frequency differences. Weak coupling can only produce synchrony if the frequencies are already very close.
So it's like two singers trying to harmonize. If they are far apart in pitch, they need to really listen hard to each other to stay together. If they are close in pitch, even casual attention keeps them in sync.
That's a great analogy. And now here is the key insight. In early visual cortex, both of these factors map directly onto image properties. The frequency of gamma oscillations in a patch of visual cortex depends on the local contrast of the image. Brighter regions drive faster gamma. So contrast differences between image regions create frequency detuning. Meanwhile, the coupling strength between neural populations depends on how close they are on the cortical surface. And because the visual cortex is organized like a map of the visual field, cortical distance corresponds to physical distance between image locations.
Oh, So a region of the image that has uniform contrast would have low detuning among the neurons encoding it. And if those neurons are also close together, coupling is strong. They would synchronize easily.
Sharp thinking, exactly right. A region with wildly varying contrast would create large frequency differences among its neurons, high detuning, and those neurons would resist synchrony. The figure in a visual scene can literally announce itself through synchrony while the background stays desynchronized.
This is almost like the brain building a fence around the figure by making its internal neurons tick together.
A beautiful way to put it, and there is a concept from physics that captures the precise boundary between synchronizing and not synchronizing. It is called the Arnold tongue. Imagine a triangular zone. On one axis you have frequency detuning, on the other you have coupling strength. Inside the triangle, oscillators synchronize. Outside it, they do not. The prediction from TWCO is that human perceptual performance should trace out exactly this kind of triangular zone when you vary those two parameters.
So they actually tested this with human participants. How do you turn a mathematical theory about oscillators into a psychology experiment?
This is where the design becomes really clever. They created visual textures made of small ring-shaped patterns called GABA annuli, each one a tiny circular grating, arranged on a grid covering the screen. Each annulus had its own local contrast value. Within one rectangular region of the display, the contrasts were drawn from a narrow range, meaning low heterogeneity. In the surrounding background, the contrasts span the full possible range, meaning maximum heterogeneity.
So the figure was defined purely by the statistical uniformity of contrast, not by any edge or shape boundary.
Exactly, no hard border separated figure from background. The only cue was that the figure region had more similar contrast values among its elements. Participants had to judge whether this hidden rectangle was oriented horizontally or vertically, a forced two-choice decision.
And they varied the two TWCO parameters systematically.
Yes, in a 5x5 grid of conditions, 25 combinations in total. Contrast heterogeneity within the figure was varied across 5 levels, from nearly identical elements to elements spanning almost the full contrast range. Grid coarseness, the spacing between the annuli, was also varied across 5 levels. Fine grids meant nearby elements and hence stronger coupling between the neural populations encoding them. Coarse grids meant elements farther apart and weaker coupling.
So contrast heterogeneity maps onto detuning, and grid coarseness maps onto coupling strength. They were literally building the Arnold tongue diagram in human visual experience.
Precisely, 8 participants completed this across 9 daily sessions, 8 training sessions, and 1 transfer session where the figure was moved to a new location in the visual field. That transfer test was designed to check whether any learning was tied to a specific retinal location, which is an important prediction of the model's learning mechanism.
And they built a computational model too, right?
Yes, and this is crucial. They constructed a network of 400 coupled phase oscillators arranged to mimic primary visual cortex, the area called V1, the first cortical region to receive visual input. Each oscillator's natural frequency was set by the local contrast in its receptive field, the patch of visual space it responds to following measurements from macaque monkeys. Coupling strength between oscillators declined exponentially with cortical distance, again using parameters taken from independent monkey neurophysiology data.
So the model parameters were not adjusted to fit the human data. They came from a completely different species and a different experiment.
That is the key methodological strength. The model made genuine blind predictions, and for learning, they added a Hebbian learning rule named after psychologist Donald Hebb, whose principle states that neurons that fire together wire together. Pairs of oscillators that showed synchronized activity on correct trials had their coupling strength gradually strengthened between sessions, bounded by a biological maximum.
So what did they actually find? Did the human data match the TWCO prediction?
Remarkably well, when they plotted discrimination accuracy across all 25 conditions, the result formed a triangular region of high performance, a behavioral Arnold tongue. Accuracy above 75% correct was confined to exactly the zone where TWCO predicts synchrony should be possible. Low contrast heterogeneity combined with fine grids, or at least fine enough grids, to compensate for moderate heterogeneity.
The math from physics showed up directly in human perception data.
Yes, the statistical effects were very clear. A one standard deviation increase in contrast heterogeneity reduced the odds of a correct response by approximately 44%. A similar increase in grid coarseness reduced the odds by around 23%. Both effects had near certain credibility in the Bayesian analysis.
What about the computational model? Did its synchrony map match the behavioral accuracy map?
Closely, and when the researchers tested whether model synchrony was actually the best predictor of human performance, comparing it against simpler alternatives like average firing rates or the difference in firing rates between figure and background, synchrony came out clearly on top. In model comparison terms, synchrony received a predictive weight of 90%. Average firing rates alone received effectively 0 weight. A one standard deviation increase in model synchrony more than doubled the odds of a correct human response.
That is a strong endorsement of the synchrony-based account. Now, what about learning?
The learning results were equally compelling. Over 8 training sessions, participants steadily improved, but the nature of improvement was specific and matched the model's predictions precisely. The effect of contrast heterogeneity became stronger session by session. The triangular zone of good performance gradually extended, with participants becoming able to tolerate increasingly coarse grids over time, as long as contrast heterogeneity stayed below a critical cutoff.
And the model predicted this growth using the Hebbian learning rule.
Yes, using a leave one out cross-validation procedure, where learning parameters were estimated from 7 of the 8 participants and then used to predict the 8th. The simulated Arnold tongue growth tracked the behavioral Arnold tongue growth with consistent quantitative agreement across sessions. The size of the model's synchrony zone predicted the size of the behavioral performance zone.
And the transfer session confirmed that the learning was location-specific.
Exactly, when the figure moved to an untrained part of the visual field, performance dropped back to the levels seen in early training sessions. The learning reset, just as the model's local learning rule predicted. Performance in the transfer session was practically equivalent to session 2, the earliest session after participants had familiarized themselves with the task itself.
Let me try to put the mechanistic story together. The figure contains elements with similar contrast. Their V1 neurons have similar natural gamma frequencies, low detuning. Those neurons are also close together on the cortex, strong coupling, so they fall inside the Arnold tongue and synchronize. The background, with wild contrast variation, has neurons with very different frequencies, high detuning, so they stay desynchronized. Something downstream reads out this difference in synchrony, and that allows perception of the figure.
You've got the core of it exactly right. The synchrony acts as a grouping signal. What matters is not whether individual neurons fire more or less. What matters is whether they fire in rhythm with each other. The background stays noisy. The figure rings like a chord.
And through learning, the connections between V1 neurons that successfully synchronized on correct trials get gradually strengthened. So the next session, those connections are a bit more likely to push neurons past the synchrony threshold.
Exactly. The Hebbian rule effectively widens the Arnold tongue with experience. That is why participants could eventually perceive figures under conditions that were impossible for them on the first day.
What does this mean more broadly? Does it generalize beyond contrast-defined textures?
The authors argue this could be a unifying principle for visual figure-ground segregation generally. Many different stimulus properties support figure detection, orientation differences, spatial frequency differences, color, motion, direction. Through the TWCO lens, all of these features influence either detuning or coupling strength. Orientation and spatial frequency differences change the gamma frequency of neurons. Physical proximity of elements determines coupling. A single synchrony-based mechanism could explain why all of these diverse features support figure perception without invoking a separate detector for each one.
And the authors even connect this to schizophrenia.
Yes, carefully. Schizophrenia is associated with disrupted perceptual grouping and disrupted visual gamma oscillations. Recent anatomical work found reduced dendritic spine density, meaning fewer connection points on neurons in layer 3 of V1 in patients with schizophrenia. The authors suggest this could weaken lateral coupling strength in V1, shrinking the Arnold tongue and making synchrony harder to achieve, potentially contributing to the perceptual grouping difficulties observed in the disorder. The authors frame this as a hypothesis based on converging evidence, not a direct finding of their study.
So the framework opens a new lens for understanding perceptual disorders, not just healthy vision.
And it does so with a mechanism that is mathematically principled, biologically grounded, and now supported by human psychophysical data and a model calibrated on primate neurophysiology.
If I had to put today's surprise in one sentence, the thing that genuinely inverts what I thought I knew, what would you say it is?
The very properties that were used to argue against gamma synchrony as a perceptual mechanism, that it varies with stimulus features, that it depends on distance, are precisely what makes it work as a grouping mechanism. The supposed flaws were the features all along.
The critique was actually pointing at the solution without realizing it.
And the evidence comes from two directions reinforcing each other: human psychophysics producing a behavioral Arnold tongue, and a computational V1 model calibrated on monkey neurons predicting that exact shape and its evolution through learning. Today's paper is Principles of Gamma Synchrony Predict Figure Ground Perception in Texture Stimuli by Maryam Karimian, Mark Jonathan Roberts, Peter de Weerd, and Mario Senden. Published in eLife in April 2026. Thank you for listening to OSCI Pod.
See you next time.